There's a specific moment that happens for certain men, usually somewhere in their late 40s or 50s, after decades of a particular kind of exhaustion that they've never quite been able to name accurately. It's not physical exhaustion. They've handled physical demands their entire lives without complaint. It's not even emotional exhaustion in the way that phrase is commonly used. It's the exhaustion of performance, the specific, accumulated fatigue of spending 30 years carefully managing how you're perceived, editing what you say before you say it, softening positions to avoid friction, agreeing with things you don't agree with to preserve social comfort, shaping yourself, your opinions, your preferences, your reactions, around what will produce the most favorable response from the people around you. It's the exhaustion of a man who has been, for decades, more concerned with how he lands than with where he actually stands. And one day, without dramatic announcement, without a speech or a confrontation or a deliberate decision, something in him simply stops. He stops performing, stops editing, stops shaping himself around others' reactions, stops the relentless calculation of how to be liked, and something unexpected happens when he does. This is Mr. Eugene, and today we're talking about the man who stopped trying to be liked and finally started being respected. What drives a man to that stopping point? What actually changes when the performance ends? Why likability and respect are far more in conflict than most men realize, and why the men who finally choose respect over likability consistently report that this shift was one of the most significant of their lives. Let me start by being precise about what trying to be liked actually means, because it's not the same as being a good person or caring about others. Genuinely good men care about the people around them. They're considerate. They think about impact. They take others into account when making decisions. None of that is what I'm describing. What I'm describing is something different and more corrosive. The pattern where a man's internal experience, his actual opinions, preferences, positions, and reactions are consistently subordinated to the goal of producing a positive response in others. The man who tries to be liked doesn't just consider others. He filters himself through others. Before he speaks, he runs an internal calculation. How will this land? Will this create friction? Will this person be disappointed or upset? Will this make me seem difficult, demanding, or unkind? And the result of that calculation, more often than not, is a modified version of what he actually thinks. A softened position, a manufactured agreement, a performance of enthusiasm he doesn't feel or acceptance of something he doesn't actually accept. This filtering happens so automatically and has been operating so long that many men don't even recognize it as filtering anymore. It just feels like being diplomatic, being reasonable, being the kind of man who doesn't cause unnecessary conflict. But here's what the filtering actually costs over time, and why the exhaustion it produces is so specific and so deep. Every time a man filters his authentic response to produce a more palatable one, he creates a small internal split, a distance between what he actually thinks and what he expressed, between who he actually is and who he performed himself to be in that moment. Individually, these splits are trivial, but accumulated across 30 years of daily interaction, across thousands of conversations and decisions and social moments, they produce something significant. A man who has lost genuine contact with his own authentic experience, who has been performing so long and so consistently that he genuinely isn't sure anymore what he actually thinks versus what he's been trained to say he thinks. This is the deepest cost of chronic approval seeking, not the social exhaustion, though that's real, not the resentment, though that accumulates too, the loss of yourself, the gradual erosion of the clear interior signal that tells you what you actually believe, want, value, and stand for. Men who have been deep in this pattern for decades often describe an unsettling vagueness when asked what they genuinely want or think about something that matters. They've outsourced their self-definition to others' reactions for so long that the authentic interior voice has gone quiet from disuse. And it's from that specific place of profound vagueness and exhaustion that the stopping point arrives. Something triggers it. Sometimes it's a single moment of clarity, a conversation where he hears himself performing agreement with something he finds genuinely wrong, and the dissonance is finally loud enough to be undeniable. Sometimes it's a longer accumulation, a gradual recognition that the relationships built entirely on his performance of likability contain no one who actually knows him. Sometimes it's loss, the death of someone he loved, a serious health scare, the end of a marriage that forced a reckoning with who he actually is when the performance context disappears. Whatever the trigger, the internal shift is the same. He stops caring about being liked with a completeness and a finality that surprises him, not bitterly, not with anger toward the people he was performing for, simply a quiet withdrawal of investment in the approval of others as a primary organizing principle of how he moves through the world. And what follows is one of the most disorienting and ultimately clarifying experiences of a man's life. The first thing he notices is silence. The internal negotiation, the constant background calculation of how to manage others' perceptions, simply isn't running anymore. The mental bandwidth that was perpetually occupied by impression management is suddenly available. This feels strange before it feels good. He's so accustomed to the background noise of social calculation that its absence initially registers as emptiness rather than freedom. He keeps reaching for the familiar anxious checking. Did that land well? Did I offend someone? Did I come across the right way? And finding nothing there. The checking has stopped. And gradually, into that silence, something starts emerging. His actual voice, the one that was always there but had been consistently subordinated to the performance. Opinions with edges. Preferences that don't defer to what's convenient for everyone else. Reactions that are genuinely his rather than calibrated to produce approval. For many men, this is the first time in decades they've heard this voice clearly. And it's both more certain and more interesting than the performed version they've been presenting for years. The second thing that changes is his tolerance, and this one catches people around him off guard. A man performing for approval tolerates an enormous amount. Disrespectful treatment he absorbs rather than address because conflict might cost him likability. Decisions made without genuine input from him that he accepts rather than challenge because challenging might make him seem difficult. Time and energy requests that exceed what he can reasonably give that he honors anyway, because declining might disappoint someone. When the performance stops, the tolerance recalibrates to something honest. He starts declining things that genuinely don't serve him. Not angrily, just clearly. He stops absorbing treatment that no self-respecting man should absorb. Not dramatically. He simply doesn't. He stops giving his time and energy to things and people that return nothing real in exchange. Not with resentment, just with a calm recognition that his resources belong to him and deserve to go where they actually matter. This recalibration, observed from outside, can look like he's become more difficult, more demanding, less accommodating. People who benefited from his old tolerance find the new version unsettling. But what's actually happened is simpler and more honest than becoming difficult. He's just stopped pretending. Stopped performing acceptance of things he doesn't actually accept. Stopped manufacturing warmth toward people who haven't earned it. Stopped being endlessly available to everyone at the cost of being genuinely available to no one, including himself. The third change, and the most significant one in terms of how his world responds to him, is what happens to the respect he receives. Here is the paradox that most men don't understand until they've lived it. Likability and respect are not the same thing. They are not even particularly compatible, and spending decades optimizing for one consistently undermines your access to the other. The man who shapes himself around others' approval is easy to like in a certain shallow way. He agrees with you. He doesn't create friction. He accommodates your preferences and doesn't push back on your decisions. He's pleasant and manageable and undemanding. But he's almost impossible to genuinely respect, because genuine respect requires that you sense someone has a real interior, standards they actually hold, positions they won't abandon to smooth social waters, a self that exists independent of your approval of it. When a man constantly shapes himself around your reactions, you can't respect him because there's no stable thing to respect. You're just encountering a mirror that reflects what you want to see. And mirrors, however pleasant, don't command respect. But the man who stops performing, who begins expressing his actual positions even when they create friction, who declines things he genuinely doesn't want to do without manufacturing elaborate justifications, who holds lines he believes in regardless of whether holding them costs him approval, that man becomes respectable, because he becomes real. People around him begin to sense, often without conscious articulation, that they're dealing with someone who has an actual self, that his agreement when it comes means something because his disagreement when it comes is also real, that his yes carries weight because his no is genuine, that he can be trusted to be who he is, rather than whoever the moment seems to require. In that quality, that stable authenticity, commands a respect that no amount of likability performance ever produces. Men who make this shift consistently report the same observation. The relationships that depended on their performance, the ones built on their endless accommodation and agreement, often cool or disappear. The people who valued them primarily for what they could be shaped into find the authentic version less useful and drift away. And the relationships that remain, or that newly form in this more authentic period, have a different quality entirely. Deeper, more honest, built on genuine recognition of who he actually is, rather than appreciation for how well he performs. The friendships formed after the shift tend to be fewer and significantly more real. The professional relationships tend to carry more genuine weight because his input is understood to reflect what he actually thinks rather than what he calculated would land best. Even his relationship with himself changes. The vagueness clears, the authentic interior voice gets louder and more reliable. He starts trusting his own judgment in a way that was impossible when his judgment was always being filtered through others' potential reactions. I want to address something here directly because there's a version of this shift that goes wrong and is worth distinguishing from what I'm describing. Some men, when the performance exhaustion becomes unbearable, overcorrect. They don't simply stop performing, they become actively contemptuous of others' opinions, deliberately provocative, using the language of authenticity to justify simple rudeness or indifference to others' legitimate needs. This is not the shift I'm describing, this is just a different performance. Instead of performing likability, performing hardness. Instead of shaping himself around approval, shaping himself around disapproval as a form of rebellion. Both versions are still fundamentally reactive, still organized around others' responses rather than genuine interior values. The real shift is quieter and less dramatic than either. It's not performing for approval or performing against it. It's simply being who you are, expressing what you actually think, holding what you actually believe, without the performance apparatus operating in either direction. That man is not trying to be liked, but he's also not trying to be disliked. He's just present, honest, grounded in something real about himself that doesn't require others' validation to remain stable. And that groundedness, more than any other single quality, is what produces genuine respect from the people worth having it from. Let me say something directly to the men in this audience who recognize the exhaustion I described at the beginning of this conversation. If you're tired of the performance, that tiredness is information. It's telling you something important about the distance between who you've been presenting yourself as and who you actually are, about the cost of organizing your life around others' approval rather than your own authentic values. You don't have to make a dramatic announcement. You don't have to have a confrontation or burn anything down. The shift doesn't require theater. It requires something quieter and more sustainable. Just start being honest, in small ways first, then larger ones. When you disagree, say so calmly without manufacturing agreement. When you don't want to do something, decline without an elaborate justification. When someone treats you in a way you don't accept, say clearly that you don't accept it without apology for having a standard. Let the reactions come. Some will be negative. Some people will find the authentic version of you less convenient than the performing version. That's fine. Their convenience is not your responsibility. And watch what happens over time to the quality of the relationships that remain and the ones that form. Watch what happens to your own interior clarity. Watch what happens to the way you feel about the man you see when you stop editing him for others' consumption. The man who stopped trying to be liked didn't lose something when the performance ended. He found something. The thing he'd been performing over for decades. Himself. And what he found, it turned out, was worth considerably more than the approval he'd been trading it for all those years. Men, at what point in your life did you start caring less about being liked and more about being real? And what changed when you did? Subscribe for the conversations that help good men find their way back to who they actually are beneath everything they were performing to be.